Hi students, welcome back, and today we are going to talk about digital negotiations, lecture number 25. In the module on digital ethnography, I had said that we will be using a case study to understand how digital ethnography can be conducted, how can that method be adopted to understanding forms of communication. So, in today's lecture, we are going to use this study titled Why the Everyday is Essential, Navigating Censorship and Surveillance on WeChat in China to illustrate our argument. So, as the title suggests, what you see is that we are going to talk about the everyday. As I had already told you that for digital ethnographers, for internet ethnographies, the everyday is very essential, and we are going to look at censorship, surveillance and the WeChat platform in the Chinese context. Now, the digital infrastructures like WeChat, Chinese mobile text and voice messaging app primarily exist in most countries. In the Chinese context, they have their own set of digital infrastructure through which they exchange information. Exchanges through this infrastructure also touch on sensitive issues like urban restructuring, quality of healthcare, political and corporate corruption, environmental pollution and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, interestingly, the perception that very often people have of China is that it is authoritarian, it is autocratic. So, therefore, when we have to understand digital communication in this context, how do we locate it? I think it is also an interesting way to think about non-Western democratic and other context as well, where the focus is not only on Western democracies, but on other contexts. Like in the previous lecture, we discussed the role of social media in contributing to what would eventually be known as the Arab Spring. So, in this lecture, we are going to sort of think about how are digital infrastructures like the WeChat platforms used in the Chinese context to think about exchanging information around these topics. Now, app based forms of contentious communication, what they represent is mostly informal communication, as you know. For instance, we use WhatsApp for informal communication, and these communication could be infused with humor as well as gossip, and then revolve around personal interactions which may be entangled with everyday practices. So, you have a very informal nature of communication on these apps. Yet, the authors Cloet and Poel suggest that they could also potentially affect public political communication, and this is what they want to explore in this study. Is there a public political communicative role that WeChat, which is a mobile text and voice messaging app, performs. Now, when we are thinking about WeChat, the author suggests that WeChat was crucial in organizing the white paper protest at the end of 2022, through which Chinese citizens had expressed discontent with the COVID-19 policies. All of you will remember that China had very strict policies to curtail the virus at that time, and while Western countries and other countries did not get a sense of what China did, how did they contain the virus, and what kind of laws were there for citizens. There was a protest which is known as the white paper protest, and WeChat was very crucial to it. So, what we are trying to understand is how do users communicate sensitive issues when they are aware of surveillance and censorship. Like I mentioned, the general perception is that China has surveillance and censorship. So, then how do users, when you are aware of existing censorship, what do you do? How is the communication of sensitive issues entwined with daily communicative practices, and how do users negotiate the Chinese system, in this case of WeChat online surveillance and censorship? Negotiations are very crucial for individuals and people who live in society, because there are many laws and regulations with which we have to negotiate at an everyday level. The Chinese state makes extensive efforts to control online content. They also force social media corporations to filter the activity on their platforms very systematically and regularly, and prompt users to self-censor. self censorship is very crucial because users are very conscious of what they should be saying and what they shouldn't be saying, just for the fear of basically impact of saying something which may be against what would be seen as the authorities. So, how do social media users balance censorship and communication of sensitive issues in their everyday lives? So, for this purpose it is crucial to look at communication of sensitive issues within the flows of everyday communication, particularly in China and maybe other related authoritarian context as well. Now, users navigate and trick the system. So, this is one of the ways in which they negotiate. For instance, they shift to other platforms, they poke fun at the expected short duration that their post will stay online because they may delete it after that, or they also express critique indirectly. Now, the dynamic, volatile and shrinking space of sharing sensitive information, as even the most hidden transcripts are bound to remain visible, is there. So, there are ways in which small forms of resistance are vulnerable and certainly not bulletproof to state repression and online harassment. So, while people engage in that kind of negotiation, they also know that there could still be censorship, there could be online harassment. Now, James Scott talked about infra-politics, which is primarily low forms of resistance that dare not speak in their own name, meaning that all resistance will not be like what we discussed in the previous class, that is the Arab Spring, where resistance is completely overt and visible to everyone. Some resistance is low profile and it happens in the micro kind of locales and locations, and this is what the author suggests that Chinese people do when they are engaging in WeChat chats. So, how people in the face of systematic repression develop strategies of resistance is something that Scott emphasizes to talk about how we can basically understand the political much more broadly. So, to expand on one's understanding of what we mean by political resistance, it is also important to understand this very micro level forms of resistance. This is particularly important in the case of China, where citizens are confronted by an authoritarian state and therefore, they choose not to engage in open political opposition. So, they may not be doing very open political resistance, but have resort to these micro kind of resistances. Chinese contentious politics as playful and non-confrontational can be observed on WeChat and also other Chinese social media platforms. So, what you have is an observation of these apps. Now, WeChat's business strategies and the Chinese state control efforts are deeply inscribed into the application's architecture. One can say that this is the digital infrastructure which affects how the content circulates on the platform and how it also can be collected. The platform's publicly available application programming interfaces, they enable data exchanges with a broad range of online services, including the major social media platforms, as well as a rapidly growing number of apps that use WeChat's payment system. So, you can see very similar infrastructural kind of characteristics to WhatsApp. And how communication is maintained. So, WeChat's APIs, they are geared towards integrating external apps into its platform, but are not set up to facilitate the collection of public user data for research purposes. This is important because that also gives the users a sense of data protection and what they would consider data privacy. WeChat did not offer a search feature to find specific types of accounts or messages till 2018. This changed in the late 2019 when it started to provide a limited search feature from which all sensitive information is excluded and restricted to verified institutional accounts only. Again, you see a sense of the data privacy. Instead, relevant public accounts and group chats were spread mostly through online word of mouth and article sharing. So, what is there is some sense of privacy in WeChat, in the messaging app, which is also very crucial to how micro forms of resistance take place in it. Now, these scholars obtain or rather use an ethnographic approach to gain insight in how contentious exchanges take shape in everyday forms of social media communication. So, how do they execute their digital ethnography? They participate in 4 very popular WeChat groups, which mostly consisted of Beijing based members. So, this is the first step, that you identify the field and then you gain an entry into the field. Then they followed the communication and activities like group excursions, information records, articles that were shared, photos, videos sharing, sports record sharing, etc., for each group for 6 months. This is the timeline. If you go back to our lecture on digital ethnography, you will realize how I had highlighted that you need a specific timeline to also think about research in the digital space. So, they have set a timeline of 6 months. Now, there was also a criteria for selecting the 4 WeChat groups, and at least 30 members have to be there, active for more than 6 months. It had to include different age groups and agreed that their conversations were observed and used in anonymized form for academic analysis. This is important because this is also ethical compliance, that you tell the users, the respondents, that you will be there as academics, researchers, you want to observe their content. So, you know, you will need permission to be there, but of course, you will anonymize that chatting those messages then for your research. The selected groups respectively consisted of ping pong players. It was 36 members in that group. They were mostly retired. The Tsinghua University alumni, which had plus 100 members and mostly young. Then there was a sent down youths during the Cultural Revolution, which had 60 members, and then a public health activist group plus 200 members, different ages. What you notice is a diversity in also the sample size and very careful selection of the respondents. So, the research protocol that was followed is that notices were posted in all group chats, that materials would be collected from the chats, allowing users to object. All collected materials were anonymized. This ethical compliance again is crucial to, you know, doing any digital ethnography, as we had discussed, and the authors in this case you know, adhere to them. Then first what they did is they examined how WeChat groups communicated on sensitive issues. So, how are sensitive issues being talked about? In correspondence with other studies, they do so in a highly obfuscated manner. This means that they do not talk about sensitive issues very openly, but they do it covertly. Most prominently, they would employ visual strategies like pictures, images, GIFs and emoticons to talk about those sensitive issues. These visual tactics fit in a longer tradition of online contention, in which the Chinese internet users, in a playful and non-confrontational manner, they express their critique and poke fun at authorities in the form of forged images and memes. So, this tactic is not new to the Chinese context, because this is also something which happens in many contexts. So, one can say that it is a universal kind of you know, strategy, that if you do not want to communicate through text, you use these visual strategies. One of the famous examples is the online circulation images of the river crab, and this is very interesting because the river crab became a symbol of censorship, and in Chinese language the word river crab is a homonym for to harmonize, which since the early 2000s was the official euphemism for censorship. So, you also see how people use humor and these kinds of visual strategies to sort of talk about questions of censorship. What is noticed is that there is a particular way in which people express their opinions on sensitive issues through humor, through visual strategies, and they may not actually be, you know, trying to make a very overt political point, but nonetheless arriving at it through some back-ended discussions. Now, contemporary WeChat users employ similar visual strategies, often in an even more obfuscated manner. So, the increase in the obfuscated manner is also drawn to the fact that there are more modes of surveillance today. One example that is taken is of June 4th, where the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre had taken place, and many users posted a picture of a candle in their WeChat moments, sometimes adding also seemingly irrelevant captions. Now, many of you may have heard of this 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and it happened on June 14th. So, on June 4th, so on every let us say anniversary of its remembrance, users would post a picture of a candle and some caption. So, it is a form of political critique which they cannot be doing very eloquently because of the government surveillance, but nonetheless they do it through these visual tactics and their own strategies. While it is public knowledge that images of candles refer to June 4th, there are many ways in which this type of silent protests can be obfuscated. So, there are ways in which you can hide your protest against what the citizens may feel was a brutal crackdown on protesters by the state. Sometimes this is done through elaborate storytelling and pretend naivete, as has been extensively documented in research on Sina Weibo. Now, this is also a very interesting strategy that you play naive, where you pretend that you do not really know the context and what has happened, and therefore, you engage in protest by basically bringing in this idea of you not knowing the context and asking different kinds of questions. So, what one sees through the digital ethnographic work that the two researchers conduct is everyday negotiation with the state in the Chinese context, where the citizens are constantly using micro and informal structures and politics to also contest against what they would see as state repression. Now, let us talk about visual contention which occurred in November 2016, when Beijing was heavily polluted by air pollution, and this had happened for more than 20 days. And at this time, numerous pictures of foggy air circulated on WeChat groups, moments and public accounts as a form of protest. So, you can see that these images were seen as a kind of protest against the state failure to provide good air to its citizens. This wave of contention reached its peak at the end of the month, when the famous actress Zhang Ji fled to Guangzhou, a city in South China, with her young baby. And she announced on Weibo, which is another platform apart from WeChat, when the flight was basically taking off, that she was flying out. Now, the print screen of the announcement was reposted everywhere, including in the WeChat groups, particularly the examined WeChat ping pong group, and it generated numerous kind of reactions. Such images circulate in groups, among groups and across other platforms. So, you see a mediatized, networked kind of also organization of digital infrastructure. This takes us to the point which I have been making in some of the lectures, that you see media being connected with each other. So, there is a mediatized and a networked kind of world. The other point is how a particular image of an actress flying out with her young baby becomes a symbol of also protest against the government, which then gets circulated in sort of other groups also. Their ambiguous meaning makes them more agile basically toward the surveillance system, and can be read as a hidden transcript. So, a hidden transcript is something which needs to be decoded. If you follow what Stuart Hall and Rolla Barth would argue, that an image in most cases is basically with a message and without a message, and that is the paradox as we had done in the semiotic approach. And in this case it is exactly how it is unfolding, that you and I may not understand what the image means, since we do not have an understanding of the cultural context, but for people who are in China, for them it was easier to identify with that as a symbol of protest. So, it basically enabled social media users to be creative, to think about their modes of protest and also circumvent censorship. Now, this is that image which was posted, which is titled or captioned "Flight from Pollution," and you can see the actress being photographed along with her a baby. And this picture was then also circulated in many groups, where there were discussions on the bad air quality of Beijing and how then government should play a role in basically thinking about improving the idea of air pollution, how air quality could be sort of also improved. Now, what this kind of a study also tells us is that in textual exchanges, it is particularly clear how communication of sensitive issues is intermingled with entertainment and everyday communication. So, topics can come and go and jokes are followed by serious remarks. So, in the groups when they are communicating in the 4 WhatsApp groups that the researchers follow, people are talking about sensitive issues, but they combine them with also everyday communication. So, this is also how people live their everyday lives. Nobody is serious all the time, nobody only talks about politics, is not it? We talk about culture, we talk about sports, we talk about our everyday lives, our personal lives, then about politics, about economy, etc. So, a very similar kind of conversational strategy is also carried out in these WeChat groups, and the group exchanges reflect upon current news issues alongside more general life related issues, and the observation confirms how online and offline realities, politics and everyday life, they are all fundamentally entangled, which means that it is impossible to separate them. So, what we see is also how the online and the offline they come together. You see the digital and the real or physical world coinciding. You see everyday small forms of resistance along with sensitive matters and other life related matters all coexisting. Interestingly, especially in the ping pong WeChat group, which consisted mostly of retired men, the authors found constant criticism of Chinese politics and society. It also reflects that for the older generation who were active in this group, they were better and more able to express their discontent with Chinese state and politics, because they feel that their prime years have been lived, and so they are more open about their resistance. The analysis of the group chats suggests that Chinese WeChat users are constantly aware of state surveillance. It is something that they know. In response, most users chose to obfuscate their critique. So, they hide their critique, they also manipulate it. Yet, there are exceptions. Some users, mostly members of an older generation, express their critiques openly, like I have already told you. And in these instances, their words are quickly followed, however, by also a different topic. So, which points to a strategy of discursive derailment, that you talk about a serious issue and then you also talk about a very non-serious issue and you deflect the attention from the former. Political contention which directly challenges the central government is unlikely. So, what kind of political contention emerges is also a focus on indirect issues of governance rather than the direct ones. Yet at the same time, the platform does enable a constant stream of obfuscated protest, in the words of what James Scott suggested, low profile forms of resistance which does not challenge central authority, but does keep the resistance alive. So, the discursive element we observe in the groups is one such example of infra politics. So, when we are thinking about infra-politics, it primarily means that politics which happens through the use of infrastructures, and these infrastructures could be at the micro level. This is, however, not to say that these low profile forms of resistance are not susceptible to state surveillance and censorship, because even obfuscated forms of contention appear to have become less frequent in recent years, and the launch of the Internet Group Information Service Administrative Regulations in September 2017 particularly made chat group administrators criminally liable for unlawful messages and limited the space for political speech. So, you see growing censorship in the digital space. This law requests from providers to monitor chats, so administrators are directly responsible, and it imposes the use of real names. One of the articles states, for example, that Internet Group Information Service providers shall cooperate with the relevant competent departments lawfully, conducting oversight inspections and provide necessary technological support and assistance. Now, as a governance strategy, this illustrates observation that the Chinese state channels its online control through private internet companies, and even more fine grained through group admins. So, you find that surveillance in the digital space is increasing. So, it is also perhaps important to think about for how long can people even participate in obfuscated forms of contention as well as resistance. Now, this study that we have been discussing, what it does is it examines everyday non-activist forms of political communication. This is important because in no way is this activism, but non-activist, and the platform used is WeChat in the Beijing region. How is the communication of sensitive issues entwined with other daily communicative practices is what is focused on, and how users negotiate the Chinese system of online surveillance and censorship. So, the authors also examine how WeChat users communicate sensitive issue, knowing that almost every word and image that they share can be tracked, analyzed and acted upon. And the authors bring the work of James Scott in dialogue with Chinese internet studies to demonstrate how online contention is openly articulated, but it is simultaneously obfuscated and also disguised. The focus is on WeChat, and therefore, a digital ethnographic approach is used, which is the central node of the Chinese internet and deeply integrated into the everyday life. It is vital to situate, study and analyze online contention within the flows of everyday communication, because it gives us a sense of the interaction of the everyday with the digital, and confronted by ubiquitous surveillance and censorship, Chinese citizens, they constantly and consciously calibrate the way that they voice or do not voice opinions on sensitive societal issues. By weaving these sensitive messages through mundane exchanges on social media, they can hide in plain sight. Yet, these small forms of resistance are also vulnerable, as we have seen with the newer developments on the Internet Act and control on WeChat group admins, and certainly not bulletproof to state repression and online harassment. So, the idea of a digital ethnographic approach to studying digital negotiations in the Chinese context is to bring to all of us how we can think about WeChat or other messaging platforms also as sites and digital infrastructures that mediate these gaps between the everyday and the digital, and also offer possibility of digital micro resistance. So, on this note, we will wind up today's lecture, and I will meet you in the next one. Thank you.